Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a very interesting presentation from Professor Yan Xiaotong on the emerging bipolarity in East Asia. I will take a slightly different view and come to the balance of power question as one of the principal features of the emerging Asian geostrategic environment, but also indicate that this balance of power and transitional issues are taking place in the context of two other very important factors. So while balance of power and changing balance of power because of changing nature of economic growth, its militarization that follows it among the leading powers of Asia is taking place in the context of two other very important factors, trends, dynamics that have characterized post-Cold War Asia, and that must not be undermined. And there is contradiction as well as supplementing factors among these three important trends. The first trend is what has globalization done to Asia? Clearly, China's rise is a very important factor of this globalization, and it has been made possible by deep integration of gradual in the Asian theater and thereafter in the larger world community of China, in its institutions, norms, capital flows, trade bodies, made possible by a major cooperative and strategic reorientation in American policy towards China, and which led to Japan, Southeast Asia, South Korea, and increasingly other countries, including India, revamping their strategy towards China. Interdependence in Asia has grown as a result deeply. China itself is deeply engaged in Southeast Asia, and with Japan, interdependence with Japan is deep as well as with Korea, United States, Europe, and other major leading economic and political entities of the world. So this phenomena of deep integration, into which India is currently as well as engaged, has led to a huge growth of the Indo-Pacific region as an emerging area of interdependence, capital flows, chains of industrial chains connecting Southeast Asia, Japan, India, South Korea, and China, and an emerging range of issues relating to free trade areas, the security structure, supplementing it in the form of the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, as well as other political groupings such as ASEAN-centered groups such as the ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus India, etc. So in a series of overlapping and structures and institutions with normative elements of it which underpin a vision of a cooperative Asia, a vision of a liberal internationalist Asia, a vision of Asia that will avoid the consequences of bipolar Cold War kind of relationships re-emerging, and avoiding great power rivalry, and ensuring that the current stage of cooperation among great powers is sustained, and therefore the peace dividend that has followed the end of the Cold War is sustained long enough so that the basic problematic issues in terms of territory, history, reinterpretation of many of these questions in terms of rising nationalism can be resolved in the time through which greater cooperation, interdependence, and normative structures can be built. In short, Asia is undergoing, and particularly Asia on the eastern side of India, in which India is increasingly now integrated, because increasingly, so the South China Sea, for example, nearly 55 to 60% of India's trade is moving, connecting India to the rest of the Asia, and the older sub-regional structures of Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia are giving way to a much more interdependent, interconnected wider complex of regionalism in this part of the world. Now, this regionalism is, of course, very behind the European process. The values and that underpin the European process, the democratic institutions and structures do not exist here. So it's not the same thing in terms of regional processes, but it's nonetheless initiating a process of significant institution building, interdependence, and the consequences of it in terms of efforts to build normative and other structures and ensure that long-term process of peace and cooperation can be sustained. A second feature, of course, is the other feature that I mentioned to you, is what is happening to the state system in this part of the world. Globalization obviously has changed the nature of civil society-state relationship, as well as relationship between the states and the international community. A quick look at what is happening as computerization, financial flows, the flow of mobile-based, satellite-based communication, as well as the immediate exchange of values, ideas, etc., that's made possible by Twitter, etc., is today changing the nature of popular movements and mass movements in all these countries. People are deeply concerned about the nature of the state system and whether they deliver welfare, justice, questions relating to security in a more meaningful manner. For the first time, therefore, we are seeing in real sense, post-independence Asia, political awakening taking place across the region. Political awakening that is bringing people into greater social and political movements. They are restless, they are interconnected, and are resentful of their relative social deprivations and powerlessness in many of these cases. And they are increasingly, therefore, reject authoritarian political mobilization that has been the fate of much of Asia through this period of modernization, post-independence growth, etc. So, interesting changes are taking place within the domestic community of many of the Asian states, including some of the largest Asian states. A look at what is happening in Thailand, where the paralysis of the government is taking place over these questions, the rise of the ARC movement in India, or the rise of many small social movements, multiple social movements in China, on the question regarding corruption, how land is used, or on environmental questions and how sustainable environmental questions and processes can be sustained, are all signs that things are changing, whether in authoritarian states or in democratic states, that political reforms, social reforms, etc. are widely needed, and the state restructuring processes are very much on. In this context, therefore, it will be very naive to think that the current state systems in Asia will not be under the influence of strong social forces for change. And what that will bring to the authoritarian parts of Asia, as well as to existing democracies that have not functioned very well, remains to be seen. And I think important questions relating to the relationship between domestic factors and foreign policy and security policies, therefore, are opened up. States and regimes increasingly need to pay attention to the domestic order, and in fact, including questions relating to the existing economic strategies that have proved to be so successful in the past, export-led, high investment-oriented, which have led to, in the context of the global economic crisis, to problems of debt GDP ratio in China coming to over 200%, increasingly seen as unsustainable, and therefore needing a reorientation from the previous export-led strategy to more inward-looking strategies of change. And so I think only focusing on the external factors of power may not give us the kind of realities that Asia currently is undergoing, because these domestic factors have strong impact on what will be the nature of the debate on foreign policy, and therefore the state activities in terms of power equations, competition, strategic factors, and whether they will pursue more rivalry in their foreign policy rather than more cooperative ventures or managing these issues in a more cooperative manner. Because much of the success and the growth of Asia's economic capacities over the past 2 decades or so is significantly made possible by a relationship that is conducive to internal change in terms of foreign policy. Finally, balance of power, which Yan Shui-Tong has focused on and spoken eloquently about in terms of the bipolar Asia emerging and the China-US factor. Is little doubt that the Asian balance of power is changing, and the China factor is crucial to it. Was it lead to a bipolar Asia? From today's perspective, short-term perspective, it is clear that the US-China competition is an important element of it. It is made possible, however, not as a given. US-China relationship throughout the previous 20 years were often based on an element that was more towards cooperation. It is that made China a very important part of the American trading system, made possible stronger economic and financial engagement within China, made China the largest purchaser of American security bonds, etc., etc. So Chinese are invested in America hugely, just as Americans are, and they are likely to become their leading trading partners over the coming 10 years or so. So the competition has been kept in check, and when the American Secretary of State in a Foreign Affairs article in 2000 had talked about strategic competition between the United States and China emerging, in fact, large parts of Asia wanted that kind of environment to be taken away rather than and promote a stronger cooperative relationship and sustaining cooperative relationship between the United States and China as the basis for the growth and stability in Asia and peace in Asia. So a return to competition and rivalry between the United States and China may not actually be very healthy for the emerging future in Asia. And so just like the domestic factors are very uncertain, and what will happen to the state system and regimes in Asia remain significantly under uncertain conditions, so are the balance of power factors and the changing relationship among the great powers in Asia. Now, an important element of this competition between the United States and China flows from the way China has been managing its domestic policies in terms of increasing nationalism to asserting its territorial and other political interest abroad. Now, every country, of course, follows its national interest. They need to. But how those national interests are articulated, what are the ideological moorings of those national interests, how are they placed in terms of win-win, rivalry, liberal values, realist values, all that matters. The ideological orientations are critically important. And it seems to me that there is growing confidence in China about its own power as its power has grown, leading to a significant contradiction that has emerged from the Chinese political system itself. The leading bodies of the Chinese. One, that calls for greater cooperation and sustaining the process by which China's growth and industrialization and the wealth creation has taken place, and therefore sustaining cooperative relationship with the rest of the Asia and the United States in particular as the historical process moves forward. On the other hand, there is an increasing realization among segments of nationalist groups in China, within the elites as well as in other segments in middle classes, etc., that it's time for China to stand up and question many of the arrangements that were made when the United States was very powerful, and now that America is in greater decline or in a relative decline, what needs is to change this. And huge claims on territories in South China Sea, in areas controlled by Japan, or on Vietnam, or even for that matter, the unsettled territorial issue with India, indicate that an assertive, very assertive China is very much on and is backed up by real power. Military power in China is being built rapidly. This will inevitably lead to frictions and competition between the United States and China. But it will also mean competition with Japan. It will mean competition with India if the territorial pursuits are continued in the manner that was done, for example, last year when the Chinese forces entered 19 kilometers in Ladakh. The land of actual control was not adhered to, even a notion of it. So I think there are huge uncertainties in managing this relationship. Whether, therefore, Asia would need, it will be better off by an emerging competition flowing out of an assertive China needs to be taken look of. Yan Shetong, of course, has focused on Abe's philosophy, way the nationalism in Japan is increasing. I leave to my Japanese colleague to speak about them, since I clarify them, not focus on them so much. But from an Indian perspective, it seems to me that maintaining strategic balances is very important. And if the Chinese role in terms of assertion and great power competition becomes the essential feature of Chinese foreign policy and security policy, then willy-nilly, I think we will lead to a situation where India-Japan strategic partnership, as well as India-United States strategic partnership, is likely to grow. And despite the fact that India does not want a relationship with China to move away from engagement into rivalry of any kind or competition of any kind, willy-nilly the effects of this rivalry, the effects of bipolarity, the effects of competition between the United States and China, which are about Asian security structures, which is about trading systems, which is about naval factors and sea lanes of communication, questions relating to whether they will be settled by force or by law or norms are going to come up, in which India would not be able to take positions the way it would, and it would have to protect its security interests in a significant manner and look at this relationship in a different light. So I personally feel the rise of China has giving impetus to a whole series of questions that create currently enormous amount of uncertainties that need to be looked at, and Asian powers would be well advised to maintain strategic balance and ensure that they cannot come into conflict with each other. There cannot be any guarantee that the way territorial factors are shaping up in South China Sea, East China Sea, and elsewhere along the Chinese periphery may not lead to conflict. We cannot be sure. We have to work consistently on it to maintain and stabilize peace through a period when there are great many uncertainties. Thank you.